History usually remembers the 1930s and 40s for the noise. We think to scenes of screaming sirens, speeches over the radio, and the roar of tanks crossing the border. But for hundreds of millions of people, the defining experience of that era was actually the silence. It was the silence of a dinner table where a father refused to speak his mind, terrified that his own children, indoctrinated at school to put the state above family, might innocently repeat his complaints to a teacher. It was the silence of a factory floor where a worker vanished during the night shift, and the next morning, the man working next to him kept his head down too, afraid to even ask where he went. While the armies of the world were preparing for a war of conquest, their governments were already fighting a different kind of war. It was an internal war, waged against their own populations. To fight it, they needed a new kind of profession. Across Europe and Asia, apparatus of control was being built, brick by brick. In the Mediterranean, a surveillance network was constructed so densely that the boundary between private life and state loyalty effectively dissolved. In the Far East, legal authority was granted to prosecute citizens for the political pollution inside their minds. Today, we're opening the archives to conduct a forensic audit of the police state in its deadliest prime. We're going to analyze the systems that turned ordinary citizens into informants and bureaucrats into mass murderers. The first organization we'll look at set the gold standard for terror. To understand the German secret police, we first have to dismantle a 70-year-old myth. Post-war culture has trained us to view the Gestapo as omnipresent, with secret agents on every corner. But when historians like Robert Gelatelli and Frank McDonough cracked open the surviving case files, they found that the Geheime Staatspolizei was shockingly, almost recklessly understaffed. The math simply doesn't add up to a totalitarian surveillance state. In 1937, for a population of 66 million people, the Gestapo employed only 7,000 officially ranked officers. Take the specific case of Dusseldorf. This was a critical industrial region with nearly 1 million people and a hotbed of former communists. The local Gestapo office had a total staff of just 281 men. There were entire German towns that never saw a Gestapo officer in uniform for the duration of the Third Reich. By all logic, this police state should have collapsed. It lacked the manpower to enforce its own will, and yet it successfully paralyzed a continent. How? The answer lies in the fact that the Gestapo functioned as a processing agency. It didn't need to go out and find the enemies of the state because the German people delivered them to the doorstep. Detailed studies reveal that up to 80% of all investigations were initiated by denunciations, tips from ordinary citizens. The Gestapo relied almost entirely on the willingness of the population to spy on itself. This turned the secret police into a weapon for settling private scores. The archives are full of petty grievances masquerading as patriotism. A business owner would report a competitor to drive them into bankruptcy. A wife would report a husband for listening to foreign radio simply because she wanted a divorce. The Gestapo was well aware of this, complaining internally about the flood of baseless slander. But they realized that this web of mutual suspicion was more effective than any surveillance network. They didn't need to watch you because you were terrified that your neighbor was. This leads us to the second major misconception, the nature of the fear. We assume everyone was afraid all the time, but the historian Eric Johnson proposes a different reality: selective terror. For Jews, communists, and the mentally ill, the terror was absolute, but for the vast majority of the Aryan population, the Gestapo was a service. Surveys reveal that many Germans viewed the secret police as a guardian. If you were a law-abiding citizen, you could go your entire life without fearing a knock on the door. This consensus allowed the Gestapo to operate with cold professionalism. The men who ran these offices weren't typically screaming sadists. Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, was a career detective who served under the previous democracy. He was a bureaucrat who treated hunting humans with the emotional detachment of a tax auditor. This bureaucratic nature allowed the system to scale up the genocide. The officer saw himself as an administrator processing a file. The suspect was identified by a neighbor, arrested by a local cop, and deported by a train scheduler. The responsibility was sliced so thin that no single person had to carry the weight of the crime. However, as the war turned against Germany, this consensus fractured. By 1943, the voluntary denunciations dried up, the people stopped helping, and forced to transform, the Phantom Bureaucracy replaced detectives with fanatics. In the final months, they became the monster of popular imagination, hanging defeatists from lampposts. But we must remember, for the first decade of its existence, the Gestapo simply placed a suggestion box in the town hall, and their citizens filled it with the names of their friends. If you crossed the border into the Soviet Union, the logic of terror changed instantly. Stalin's secret police, the NKVD, was a leviathan. By the height of the Great Terror, it was a state within a state that operated on a scale the Gestapo could only dream of. It ran the fire departments, guarded the borders, managed the archives, and crucially, ran a massive sector of the industrial economy. To understand why the NKVD was so much more lethal, we have to understand the concept of social prophylaxis. In the West, you generally had to do something to get arrested. In the East, your guilt was determined by who you were. The leadership viewed society like a gardener views a plot of land. Certain groups, aristocrats, priests, wealthy peasants, or ethnic Poles, were weeds. They were classified as socially harmful elements and had to be removed to sanitize the soil. This logic birthed the most terrifying invention of the police state, the quota system. On July 30th, 1937, the Politburo issued Operational Order 00447. This document abandoned the pretense of investigation. Instead, it assigned every region a numerical target, broken down into two categories. Category 1, which meant the person would be shot immediately, and Category 2, which meant the person would be sent to the Gulag for 10 years. A provincial chief would receive a sealed package, execute 2,000 people, and imprison 5,000. The terror was run like a factory. If a chief only found 1,000 enemies, he was underfulfilling his plan. In 1937, failing to meet the plan meant you weren't doing your job properly, so officers would improvise so as not to become one of those number. They opened phone books and selected names at random. They raided markets, arresting anyone without proper papers. In Turkmenistan, a unit ran out of spies, so they arrested passerbys at a bazaar to fill the Category 2 quota. The horror escalated into a grotesque socialist competition. Archives show local officers writing to Moscow requesting higher quotas, treating executions like production targets to secure promotions. In Omsk, the local chief requested to increase his execution quota from 1,000 to 8,000 in a single month. Stalin personally signed the approval. To process these people, the NKVD bypassed the courts. They created the Troika, a three-man tribunal that reviewed stacks of files, stamped them shoot, and moved on. A Troika could sentence hundreds in a single afternoon. The most unique feature of the NKVD, however, was its self-destructive nature. The internal politics were defined by cannibalism. Genrikh Yagoda, who built the camps, was executed. His replacement, Nikolai Yezhov, oversaw the peak slaughter, only to be arrested and tortured by his successor, Lavrentiy Beria. In this system, being a policeman was one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. This created a manic energy, and every officer worked with a gun to his own head. He had to find an enemy to destroy, or he would become the enemy himself. The result was a death toll that dwarfs the pre-war Nazi figures. In 1937 and 1938 alone, the NKVD executed approximately 680,000 people. That's an average of 1,000 executions every single day for 2 years straight. The Kempeitai is often compared to its Western counterparts, but this creates a false equivalency. The European agencies were political organizations. The Kempeitai was a branch of the Imperial Army. Every officer was a soldier first, a policeman second. This distinction is vital. In Europe, there was a pretense of legal process with warrants and files. In the territory controlled by the Kempeitai, the law was whatever the officer standing in front of you decided it was. Their mandate was protecting the kokutai, the national essence. Inside Japan, they worked with the thought police, or toko, to police the interior life of the citizen. Under the peace preservation law, holding dangerous thoughts became a crime. But once the army moved overseas, this psychological pressure transformed into physical horror. In occupied territories like the Philippines or Malaya, the Kempeitai operated without habeas corpus. They could arrest without warrants and hold people indefinitely. Crucially, local commanders had the power of summary execution for hindering the imperial army. The terror was on a different level. In a European cellar, torture was to extract data. In a Kempeitai situation, torture was about enforcing submission. Their signature technique was the water cure. Gallons of water were forced down a victim's throat until the stomach was distended. Then, a guard would jump on the stomach, forcing the water back out, often rupturing organs. They also used bamboo slivers under fingernails and suspension by the thumbs. This attitude extended to the ultimate outsider, the prisoner of war. Westerners were shocked by the contempt they faced. To the Japanese military police, a soldier who surrendered had forfeited his honor. He may have been biologically alive, but he was socially dead. This is why they felt no compunction about using POWs for bayonet practice or medical experiments. In their eyes, they weren't killing men, they were disposing of waste. Before there was a Gestapo, and before there was an NKVD, there was the OVRA. It's impossible to audit the police states of the 1930s without looking at the organization that actually invented the word totalitarian. Benito Mussolini's secret police, the Organizzazione per la Vigilanza e la Repressione dell'Antifascismo, provides a crucial counterpoint to the blood-soaked machinery of Germany and Russia. It proves that a state can break up a population without necessarily piling up bodies. The OVRA was arguably the most psychologically invasive agency of the era. They relied on a suffocating blanket of surveillance and recruited heavily from the concierge class, the doormen, the hotel staff, and the postal workers, with the goal of making every Italian feel that the walls themselves were listening. Their signature weapon was the confino. If you were an anti-fascist in Italy, you were plucked from your life in Rome or Milan and dropped onto a remote or windswept island in the Mediterranean or a tiny village in the mountains. You were forced to live there, often for years, cut off from your family, your career, and your identity. It was a terror designed for a modern, civilized society, and it was so effective that the Gestapo actually studied the OVRA in the early days, trying to replicate their success in silencing the opposition without triggering a civil war. When the Nazi war machine rolled across Europe, it franchised its terror as well. It set up puppet governments in France, Croatia, Hungary, and Norway and expected them to police their own populations. But a strange phenomenon occurred. In many cases, the local secret police were more vicious, more uncontrolled, and more fanatical than the Germans themselves. The most terrifying example of this was in Croatia, under the Ustaše. When the Ustaše took power in 1941, they established their own surveillance service, the Ustaška nadzorna služba. But unlike the Germans, who tried to industrialize murder and keep it clean for the executioners, the Ustaše reveled in the intimacy of violence. Their brutality was so extreme that it actually unnerved the Nazis. There are reports in German archives from SS officers and Gestapo liaisons stationed in the Balkans writing home to Berlin and complaining about the beastly methods of their Croatian allies. When the SS, the organization running Auschwitz, is telling you to tone down the violence, you've crossed the threshold of insanity. The Ustaše targeted Serbs, Jews, and Roma with a medieval ferocity, often using knives and hammers rather than guns to save ammunition. They proved you don't need a sophisticated bureaucracy to create a police state, you just needed a license to kill. In the occupied nations of Western Europe, the police state took on a different, more psychological dimension. When France fell in 1940, the German Gestapo obviously moved in. But they were foreigners. They didn't speak the slang, they didn't know the back alleys of Lyon or the mountain paths of Vercors. To hunt down the French resistance, they needed Frenchmen. Enter the Milice. Formed in 1943 by Joseph Darnan, the Milice was a weaponization of a civil war that had been brewing in France for decades. Unlike the Gestapo, which was coolly bureaucratic, the Milice was fueled by a venomous hatred of their own countrymen. Their speciality was infiltration. They could walk into a cafe, order a drink, and just listen. They knew exactly which farmhouses had extra rooms to hide down British pilots, and they knew which priests were sympathetic to the Jews. In the archives of the French resistance, the Milice are often feared more than the SS. When a Milice captured a resistance fighter, the torture was personal. It took place in the basements of local hotels or insurance offices, conducted by men who might have gone to school with the victim. By the time the Allies had landed in Normandy, the Milice had turned huge swaths of France into a zone of fratricidal violence, executing their own citizens with a zeal that shocked even their German masters. If we move further east to Romania, the logic of the police state shifts again from the bureaucratic to the psychotic. Romania presents a unique case in our audit. It had a traditional secret police, the Siguranța, which was a standard, brutal security service. But operating alongside it, and sometimes against it, was the Iron Guard. The Iron Guard, or the Legion of the Archangel Michael, was distinct among all the fascist movements of Europe because it was a death cult. Its leader, Corneliu Codreanu, preached a doctrine where political violence was a form of religious martyrdom. While the Nazis tried to hide their atrocities in remote camps and the Soviets buried theirs in the frozen north, the Romanian fascists performed theirs in the open like a macabre theatre. During the Bucharest pogrom of 1941, the Iron Guard committed acts of violence so grotesque that they stand out even in the blood-soaked history of World War II. In the city slaughterhouse, they hung Jewish victims on meat hooks, mimicking the dressing of livestock, and labelled the corpses with stamps reading kosher meat. The violence was so chaotic and so disturbing that it caused a diplomatic crisis. The German military commanders stationed in Romania, men who were actively preparing for the Holocaust, actually filed complaints to Berlin. They demanded that Hitler intervene to stop the Iron Guard because the sheer insanity of the violence was disrupting the orderly conduct of the war. If the Gestapo was a machine and the Iron Guard was a cult, the Arrow Cross in Hungary was a gang. For most of the war, Hungary was an ally of Germany, but it retained some degree of sovereignty. Its Jewish population, while persecuted, was largely intact. But in late 1944, as the Red Army approached and the Hungarian government tried to switch sides, the Nazis staged a coup. They installed the Arrow Cross Party, led by Ferenc Szalosy. What followed was the police state, stripped of all its police and all its state. It was anarchy with a badge. The Arrow Cross didn't have time to build camps. The Russians were already on the horizon, so they simply brought the terror into the streets. In the winter of 1944, the Arrow Cross gangs, often composed of teenagers and young men armed with submachine guns, roamed the streets of Budapest. They dragged victims out of safe houses set up by foreign diplomats and marched them to the banks of the Danube River. They tied victims together in groups of 3 and then would shoot one person in the head and push them into the freezing river. The dead weight of the corpse would drag the 2 living victims under the ice to drown. It was a method designed to save ammunition, born out of pure laziness and cruelty. So, which one of these agencies were the most brutal? If we judge purely by sadism, the crown would likely go to the Kempătai or the Ustaše. Their violence was personal, visceral, and creative. They enjoyed it, but ultimately, their terror was medieval. It was messy, chaotic, and often counterproductive. It frightened people, sure, but it didn't control them, so we crossed them off the list. If we judge by scale, the NKVD seems the obvious winner. They arrested more people, built a larger camp system, and sustained their terror for much longer than the Germans. They turned an entire nation into a prison. But the Soviet terror was flawed by its own insanity. It was a system that ate its own tail. It killed its best generals, its best engineers, and its most loyal agents. It was a blunt instrument, a sledgehammer that destroyed the hand that wielded it. The Gulag was hell, yes, but it was often a hell of incompetence and neglect. Millions died, but it wasn't systematic. This leaves us with the Gestapo. When we look at the Geheime Staatspolizei, we see something that didn't exist in Russia or Japan. We see efficiency. The Gestapo is the winner of this dark competition because they achieved the ultimate goal of the totalitarian state. They co-opted the population. They achieved the ultimate goal of the totalitarian state. They didn't need a million agents to watch the population because they tricked the population into watching itself. They didn't need to rule by force alone because they ruled by consensus. The terrifying lesson of the Gestapo isn't how many people they killed, but how few officers it took to do it. They proved that you don't need a monster on every street corner to commit a genocide, you just need a suggestion box in the town hall and a citizenry willing to use it. But what do you think? In an era defined by industrial slaughter, defining the worst is a matter of perspective. Do you agree with our verdict? Does the sheer mathematical scale of the Soviet Gulag outweigh the psychological corruption of the German Gestapo? Or does the unchecked, visceral sadism of the Japanese military police deserve the title? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.